Welcome to the first episode of the Discovery Files. You have myself, Scott Briscoe, and Ahmad Saleem. We started this off a couple years back. I did an interview on your show, Expiration Radio, um, and I think what it led to is a number of really good conversations over the years, and a lot of ideas on how to start off this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that this has always been an interesting area. I mean, we tried to cover this as part of Exploration Radio, but it really kind of, I think, like you said, it kind of kicked off when you and I did that episode on discovery and, like, what is the definition of discovery? And we kind of realized, it's not a simple concept. It's pretty hard for people to describe or to give like one uh, like almost like a scientific definition of what a discovery would be because it's kind of all over the place. And so then, like to me, anyways, and this is something we've talked about. To me, that discussion kind of led to the fact that, well, actually, if it's not easy enough to describe, then actually multiple people can look at the same thing and have completely different perspectives. Um, and so this is like, where I kind of got the idea that I think discoveries are more like a movie. They're not a picture, a snapshot. There's like, like people play different roles. Like, in the first part of the discovery, you'll have a cast of actors. And, by the second part, some of them stay, some of them leave because, they've kind of fulfilled their role. And then, like at the end, like the story, the team that actually gets to the end might look completely different than the one that started. And so, yeah, so I've always, I think now when I look at it, I've always hated this concept of discovery being this like very linear, direct kind of thing. Like, it was Scott who discovered this. He was the lone genius, like, plugging away at this thing for years and years and years. I don't think that's ever I think if you dig into stories, I don't think that's ever the case. I think they tend to be more complex and they tend to have random things happen at them. Some of them are intuition, some of them is knowledge, some of them is just random shit that happens. So I think they're a lot more complex than we make them out to be, I think.
And I think that's really it's been what I find most interesting, right? Because we're supposed to be scientists, and so much of what we end up finding being involved in these discoveries is really kind of non-scientific, right? Like the human aspect, like
Hmm,
what events led up to this that are totally random and happenstance. And so it's like almost like we're pretending that it's this beautiful hard science. And it goes back to that Calvin and Hobbes. It's like it's liquor and guessing, you know? So
that's
I've got all
right.
these books on my shelf that are like, like the Conquest of Copper Mountain and, like a passion for gold. And and they're great stories, and they are a real aspect of those discoveries, right? But, like, I remember reading one about, a diamond discovery, and I'll leave it a little bit vague, but I really loved the book, and it was super interesting, and then over the years, I've just happened to run into other people who were involved in that discovery, and they've all been like, "Well, yeah, that was definitely part of it, but there's a lot more," like, there's people that were involved that didn't even get mentioned, and I thought about that in my own experience. There's been I've just happened to be lucky to have been involved in a number of different discoveries over the years in different capacities from, like, core logger to, like, senior geo and things like that, or chief geo, and they were all just one part of that discovery, right? And so I think about all the people I know that were excellent geos that really, like, helped solve a part of that riddle, like, never even get mentioned in the discussions around them, right? Like, where I even heard, stories from people about a discovery that I happened to be there, like, during that time, that I'm like, "That person didn't even come on until, like, 2 years later. What happened there? Why are
Yeah,
they?" And I hate to say, like, why are they getting credit? Because that's actually missing that film reel thing, like, where it's like people come in and out of these things, just like you said, where, like, I've left, and then later they've done the drill out, right? And it's like, or I've come in after the discovery and then been involved in a drill out, right? And, and yeah, it's we only see part of it, right? And yet the whole story is what really leads to like my interest, right? Because if we want to be better at discovery, if we want to change this like declining rate of discovery, we maybe have to actually do something different. And maybe it's the way we structure teams or lead teams or fund exploration,
that's
but
right.
something has to change. And so I've just been what I really want to get to the bottom of is what needs to change? And can we actually change it, or is it maybe just luck of, like, joining a team at the right time? So I really don't know.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think that that's what the questions that I think kind of elicit to me is that, um, yeah, like what is the environment that allows discoveries to happen? Right, like that's the question. Because you look at, I mean, we talked about this on our podcast, right? Like, the discovery of Grasberg. Like, you have Forbes Wilson's book, right? I mean, Forbes Wilson writes that book as if he was the architect of the discovery, right? But in reality, that discovery doesn't happen until Jacques Dozy kind of makes the note in his book. All right. Now Forbes Wilson's mentions it, but he doesn't probably give it the value
Yeah, the weight that
that
it had.
yeah, yeah, like, I mean, like, yeah, like Dozy played a role in it. And then Dozy doesn't find that discovery unless his porter that he had takes him up that river, up into that valley at the right time, right? So maybe the most important person in the discovery of Grasberg was the porter that takes Dozy up that river, up that valley, right? Because none
Yeah.
of the shit afterwards happens unless
If
that
that dude
happens.
hadn't have done that. And you think about how many situations like that exist, right? Where, it happened to be that, like, I know, like Dome was discovered, I think, up in Canada because someone stepped on the outcrop and scrubbed moss off, and there's gold right there. And, like, I know, like, Eleanor was, discovered. They were doing this great, program looking around, like, Quebec, and they happened to land a boat at a very high lake level, and or sorry, maybe it was a low lake level, I can't remember, but they happened to be able to land right on what became the discovery outcrop, and it's basically like
Hmm.
the only place where gold outcrops on this thing, right? And then,
So
like, there just happened to be this little part that had been eroded along, from the glacial cover, and it's like, well, how many things had to happen just right for that? And both of those, maybe they're a result of geological work, but some of it's this weird luck, and it's how many times, like, I know for me personally, years back I was doing, like, uranium exploration, and we hired this guy named Ricky, and he was great resource. Like, he'd worked in a lot of local uranium mines, and he had just, like, a lot of local knowledge, and he just took me, like, on a tour around, like, and showed me things, and it was like how differently that project might have played out, which, then you go back to like the company I worked for ended up, losing funding. And so, like, the claims don't get, like, filed. And then someone else came and, like, like they explored in the same area. And it's like, and all of our work didn't necessarily lead to that. But I think this guy Ricky probably was involved in that later too. And he's probably never gotten credit from anybody, right? Because, he's just the guy leading him around on a quad, right?
that's right. Yeah, and I think this is like, like the little moments that kind of happen. Now, like it's not to say like in the story of Grasberg or even the story of Ricky, right, that people that came later on didn't acknowledge these things and saw these things. Like, like Forbes Wilson should get the credit for being serendipitous and um taking advantage of the opportunity that was presented to him. I mean, they did a lot of work. Like, let's be honest, Freeport did a hell of a lot of work to get to Grasberg and actually make it a mine. Um, but like, I think these are kind of like the moments that sometimes matter, but they don't matter in like the big kind of picture, right? Like that their importance can be, depending on what perspective you look at, their importance can be either huge or nothing, right? Depending on how you kind of what perspective you want to look at.
Yeah, and I think that's, I don't know. So that's the aspect that I really wanna dig into, right?
One of the things that I learned about this was that it's actually not unique just to mining or mineral exploration, right? Like, if you look at other scientific discoveries, like, you look at the discovery of the DNA helix, like Watson and Crick, like the recognition that it could be a helix was actually not by either of them. It was by their like secretary, who I think, like the story goes, like she had some like architectural kind of experience, and she had done like architectural drafting and things like that. And so she was the best person to actually represent the helix structure as a staircase, and all of these type of things. So so like Watson and Cricket did some great amount of work, but if it wasn't for the little bit of like spice that, like their researcher or their assistant, I can't remember exactly what her role was in there, but like unless she plays a role, they probably would have done some great research, but the initial moment of discovery of like the helix structure and all that stuff would have been left for someone else, or never found, right? Because it would have just kind of slipped away, and some other theory might have won out at that time.
And I think that's always an interesting aspect, right? Is the people involved are not always just the geologists. Like I used to think about my wife before we had kids, would come along on exploration projects with me and go map with me and things like that. And she had a totally different perspective on what we were looking at. And sometimes just talking through problems when you encounter them in the field with someone who's not familiar
Yeah.
with it makes you realize things that you wouldn't have otherwise, right? And so how much of our discoveries is from just the people around us, like when the conversations you have with the driller, right? And it's like, because I know I've had
Yeah, that's right.
conversations with miners where they've told me things that were like incredible geological observations, and they would be the one that would tell you like, "Oh, geology is terrible, and I don't believe anything about this." But they're actually not paying attention to the science of it. They're paying attention to the observational side of it, right? And they're describing things they see in non-technical ways that lead to a better understanding. And we very rarely give credit to those people, right? It's the person that wrote the paper that gets the credit, right?
That's right. Or the person that presents it or whatever it is, right? But so I think this is maybe like we need to throw to Aisha's kind of interview, but I think if there's one idea that I would like people to walk away with is to realize that discoveries aren't a linear, simple story told by one person. Right? They are an
Yep.
accumulation of sometimes random events where someone has a serendipity to recognize the importance of these random events. And sometimes that person doesn't always end up being the one that actually makes a discovery, right? Or is there for the moment of true recognition of a discovery. But even then, like, people that can go and listen to our interview can recognize that actually even describing that one moment of discovery is painful because it's actually not an easy thing to define either.
I think, and it's interesting how many people will be involved in any given discovery, right? Where, like in the small companies I work for, it might be there's 7 people that work there and all of them were involved, right?
That's right.
Um, and then other ones, there might be 20 or 30 people involved. And I was really kind of puzzling over what's the story of the person that just logged core at this project? And can we talk to them? Will they tell us what it was like? Will they remember accurately what it was like? Or will that memory be colored by all the subsequent years of what they've
Yeah.
heard about that discovery? And I kind of go like, I realized we'll actually never get to the full and complete truth on any podcast we do
Yeah.
because it's colored by the rosy tinged glasses of hindsight, right?
And the reality is that you will never. I don't think you'll ever be able to piece like the whole story together, right? Because, like I said, some events just don't mean anything until the person with the right perspective looks at it. So maybe, like, maybe we are never going to be the people that are going to have the right perspective. Um, but we don't know that, right? So like we're only going to have to play around with it and figure out whether we are the right people to recognize it or not. So I think that's what makes it kind of cool, right? That you are not going to be you're always going to look at these things with a deficit of information. So the question really becomes is how quickly can you fill that deficit, and how quickly can you get a representative kind of idea about what the hell you're actually looking at?
Yeah. And I'm really excited about, at the beginning of this show, it'll be interviewing people we know personally because that's usually the easiest way to set these things up, right? So,
Yeah.
We're going to talk
And they're the
about
only people that will
and
say yes. So,
yeah,
like
yeah,
that's
exactly.
the
It's
way it
like
works.
Yep. And so I was thinking about eventually I want to explore this discovery of this mine, it's soon to be a mine called Cove McCoy in Nevada. And I worked for a little junior at the time and I just logged core on this project. So I had zero impact on the besides probably distracting people because they had to train me on how to log core. But it was what I'm hoping to do is interview the different people involved in that, and then later I came to Newmont and I worked with a guy who worked on the project before that junior acquired it. And he was kind of frustrated because he's like, all of the reports make it sound like we had no idea what we were doing, but we were told that we weren't allowed to explore for an underground target. So we were, 1,500 feet is all you're allowed to drill. And so we had the geological concept of what this was going to be, and we were told we weren't allowed to drill down to 1,850 feet where we ended up, like the other company ended up finding it. And so he's like, he's like, the people totally crapped all over our work, but we actually had done really good work and but it wasn't our discovery because we couldn't drill it. And it's a really interesting point, right? Is, this guy's work was good, but the company
Hmm.
had a specific economic and like they had the filter on what they were allowed to do. And that's been the case of almost everywhere I've worked where, like, oh, okay, we have a limited budget. We can drill 5 holes. So, we can't be drilling, kilometer deep holes, right? And
Yeah.
then later someone comes along and drills a deeper hole and they find something or they have a different concept. And like, we're gonna talk to Aisha about, Invincible and hopefully a number of other people on the path as well. And what I'd really like is who's the guy that drilled that first AirCore program? Because someone targeted that, right? And I don't actually know. And so maybe we can eventually track down who that person was that did that work because they had a concept. And was it we just wanna do blanket air core drilling across the area? Or was it, "Hey, I've got this target, there's no way I could convince him to drill it with diamond, but maybe I can get it in an air core program in there." And maybe they hit this, this intercept that ended up flagging Nick Van Claveren's interest later, and then their bosses at the time went, "You wanna drill on a salt lake? Like, you're insane." Who knows? And
That's
so
right.
I love that aspect of this where we assume so much about the past that we don't actually know.
And I think, I mean, like things like, I mean, we have to talk about Aisha's interview at some point, but like Invincible was a discovery under a salt lake, in a pretty prospective part of Western Australia. Yeah, like so, and I think in the interview I kind of mentioned that, like companies like WMC knew this area was highly prospective, but they probably had to wait about 20 or 25 years for technology and the methodology to catch up so they could actually drill under the salt lake. Right. So yeah, so I think like people in the '60s would have known. Yeah, like when WMC found Cambalda, like people would have known that hey, we should go drill under the Salt Lake, but and then they would have like destroyed equipment for the next whatever decade trying to drill underneath the Salt Lake and gone, yeah, it's retarded.
Yep.
Uh, and so, like you had to learn like simple things like, well, actually, how do we drive out to the middle of the salt lake? Because we can't actually drive with cars. So you have to build a causeway out to the middle of the lake, right? And then how
Yeah.
do we build drill pads out there? And what do you do with things like sumps or like, like how do you kind of handle all of these type of things? And then what happens if you take uh a slightly heavier drill rig, so something like RC, like RC weighs way more than a diamond rig does. So it's like, oh well, we got to take a much heavier equipment on. Now we got to figure out how do we build a much heavier kind of causeway to allow heavier vehicles to go out there, and all of these type of things. Yeah, so basically, I don't know. It'd be interesting to chart this, but it would probably have been at least 2 decades before people got comfortable drilling like deep holes through the salt lake in any condition.
Yep.
Like you didn't
Yep.
have to wait until it was like dry for like the 3 week period where it was dry ass and hard ground, right? So like all of these things had to happen before people could go out there and make this discovery.
And then you think about the innovation framework and the mindset that WMC built in that site, that all led to that discovery, right? Like the inquisitive nature of things, the way of documenting projects, the whole
Hmm.
company culture is essentially like, like purchased and then and then modified by Goldfields later. But how much of those things lead to discoveries, right? Where it's like if you have a culture that enables people to do better exploration work, it might result in a discovery 2 decades down the road. Whereas if you didn't
Yeah,
have that way of thinking, maybe Invincible never gets discovered, right? And you think about how much that goes on in the world where personality really matters, where it's like the personality of I remember like, Newmont had this senior VP of exploration, his name was Grigori, and, um, and he had so much, I don't know, like, force of personality that he could accomplish things in Newmont, that maybe somebody else couldn't have, right? And so I think
yeah.
about how much of this is the right person at the right time in the right role that they actually can cause ripple effects decades down the road. Like, going back to this movie analogy, maybe they were only in the scene for 2 minutes at the beginning of the show, but then, you come to the end and the plot twist at the end is like, goes back to what they had done, right?
That's fine. And also like things like like the derivative effect of these people, right? Like would anything at WMC have been done if Roy Woodall was not there, right? Like so they had to be a moment where Roy Woodall had to get the trust and ownership of WMC management to allow him to do all the crazy stuff he did afterwards, right? The way he hired people, the way he allowed teams to run, the way he, like even like Olympic Dam, right? Like, for a small company to be so ambitious in trying to go and find something under, like 300-400 meters of cover, like that obviously took a significant amount um, of trust between Roy and WMC management that this guy isn't just going to blow all the money away, right? And so this is what, like, like this is a good point you make, right? Like, if Roy Woodall had been a little bit too early in his time, maybe WMC doesn't do all of those things. Maybe like there isn't the aspect of WMC because there was no Roy Woodall. And yeah, if there's no Roy Woodall, there probably was no WMC. So a lot of these things are kind of like that sliding moment, like a sliding door moment, right? Where like it could have gone another way, and none of this could have happened.
Yeah, yeah. And it's the same thing with I think it was Hoover, President Hoover in the US, was a mining engineer. And I think he was the first guy that figured out how to do the inclined shaft like over at
Yeah,
just north of Cal there. Sons
yeah,
of Gwalia.
Laura.
Yeah, so Sons
Yeah,
of Gwalia, so they had the like, so he was in his, like, 20s when he got hired by this company to travel across the world to Australia and then go out and evaluate these projects, and his company put, like, total trust in him in his 20s to go and do this, and then he, like, recommended they buy this Sons of Gwalia prospect, and then they turn into a mine that's still operating, right? Like, I mean, it's like it's had, like, ups and downs like everything does, but the fact that a mine that President Hoover, you know, recommended 100 years ago is still in operation, that's pretty incredible? And what would have happened if, Roy Woodall's management team didn't trust him, right? Like, he would have never succeeded, right? And so I
that's
I
right.
I often think Hugo, I don't know actually know how to say his name because 'cause I've only read it, but I think, he was with BHP, if I remember right, and he was
Yeah,
the
yeah,
same
Hugo Dummett. Yeah,
yeah, and it was the same sort of force of personality where, I've talked to people that worked for him, what is it, 30 years ago now, and they talk about just how incredible of a person he was, and so then I wonder, like, with these companies, like, how how important is every level of hiring? Not just the junior geos and the project geos and the senior geos, but all the way up to your VPXs and things like that, where maybe we maybe our decline in exploration, like success has actually been related to not getting these force of personalities into the top level of companies. Or maybe they only exist once in a generation, right? But you think about, Hugo existed at the same time as Roy Woodall, right? And and then it's like,
I know.
how many I don't know. So I think about that where like, how do you identify companies that have those people so that you go, "I really wanna go work there," because then if you get enough people working, eventually they'll fill up how many slots they have, right? So then you can have, like, only the cream of the crop get the job, right? Or, like, and it's all these people want to apply. How do you build a company to attract people like that, right? And it's just fascinating to me to think about.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, a lot of that, yeah, like a lot of that, I think ends up being, um, yeah. So WMC's early success, I think, was largely because of a small group of people. Like, maybe Roy had an inordinate amount of effect on that original discovery, right? Because he could force it through with his force of nature. But I think the interesting point you raise is that everything subsequent to that really had to be because of the compounding effect of people and processes that WMC had kind of instilled. It's like, like sports organizations. I think they're a great example of this, right? That it takes a long time for them to build that culture where they just tend to be good for a long, long time. Right. Yeah, like we all know, no matter what sport you follow, there's certain organizations that just seem to have their shit together. Um, and they just win continuously, right? Like you could change people, you can change coaches, you can change, like various other aspects of it, but they still seem to do pretty well. Um, and what I find interesting about that is like how quickly you can fall apart towards the end as well. Like I think it always takes a lot longer to build up, but very quickly to destroy. And so so I think like the concept of like these good companies, like like BHP in its heyday during Hugo's time, or WMC during its heyday during Roy's time, and they were obviously not the only companies, right? I mean, there were plenty of them that kind of did this thing, and so so like their sustaining power was really because they got enough people into that vortex that they could kind of keep that mill turning over. Like, yeah, like I mean, would WMC do Olympic Dam as its first discovery? Probably not.
No, yeah,
Right?
they
It
wouldn't have
needed
had the personal capital to achieve something like that,
correct.
right?
Yeah, that's right. So you need that, I think, like in order to tackle, the 40-ton whale that is Olympic Dam, they needed a lot of people. Like, they needed the ability to have their own in-house drilling company. They needed the ability to have people that have been researching new ways of how copper could be accumulated in the subsurface. Like so Doug Haynes and these guys would have been working on this for whatever X number of years before they got to a point where, like all those ideas are kind of meshed into kind of um, a really cohesive idea. Like, see, all of this stuff just takes time, and it takes a
Yeah,
lot of people as well as like other resources to actually be able to do it.
yeah. And I often think about how much of that is stability as well, right? Where you have 3 or 4, VPXs come through a company. You don't have a, unity of purpose, right? You're gonna be switching directions every few years. And I think about how difficult it is to get all these little pieces to line up to make discoveries. And then it seems that when you do, you make multiple discoveries. You're not just making one, you're making
Yeah.
one after another until whatever moment causes that team to evaporate, right? Or even the success to evaporate, like and so I think about that a lot where, like I've taken from listening to like Roy Woodall's interviews on, like the recorded one with Berkeley he did. Like, just reading it, I didn't listen to it, but, I've taken from those things that we need to be intentional about how we build teams and who's on a team, and how do we build a diversity of experience, a diversity of thought. Like, I always hear, like, "Oh, people are a product of their circumstances," but really, they're a product of their choices after having been given a circumstance, right? And so
Yeah.
those people's different life experiences will color everything that they do from then on, right? So I go, how do we grow a team that has different life experiences so that they see a geological problem from different perspectives? And then, like I know my company has done like all these personality profiles over the years, and And so, like, one of them I think was insights, and they had, like, different colors and, "Oh, you're yellow and or
Yeah.
sorry, you're red and green and blue." And what it's really taught me, because like, the point of it all was how do you work effectively with people of different personalities than yourself? How do you leverage their assets, right? Because I have things that I'm good at, and I have a lot of things I'm really bad at, right? And so I need people on my team working with me who complement my weaknesses and whose weaknesses my strengths complement, right? And so how do you intentionally build a team that we'll become discoverers, right? Because that's what I really want, right? Like, that's what I wanna work on, that's what I wanna, like, that's what I wanna lead, that's what I wanna be involved with, is people who make discoveries. Because the excitement of making a discovery, there's nothing like that, right? When you hit that first
Yeah.
drill hole, and I remember, like, drilling in on that Helen Zone discovery with Victoria Resources, and, we drill a lot of, it's Carlin's system, and so you have, like these decalcified, like when you get like closer to mineralization, it's sometimes decalcified limestone, right? But when you get the sooty sulfides, they would sit overnight, and you'd walk into the core shed in the morning and be like, "It smells like money." And and it was a unique, like, how do you even capture that smell, right? Like, if
Hmm.
you've never been in a core shed that has, like, really hot rocks on it, that are high grade, they smell different. Like, I've never even heard of anybody trying to create an instrument that can be like, "Oh, we ran some stuff over our core boxes in the core yard, and it turns out we actually, had a near miss over here because it smells like money." Like, but the
That's right.
excitement of that, where you walk in the morning and you go, "Oh, I can't wait to log core on this because I know it's gonna be exciting." There's nothing like that feeling, right? So
Yeah, and I think, I mean, yeah. So let's throw to, I guess, kind of the interview we did Aisha, right? Like the discovery of Invincible, and so we need to put a little bit of background together on it. So yeah, so Aisha was part of the team. You were part of the team as well at that time. Aisha, as we mentioned this, like, I hope I say this like not in a derogatory way, but yeah, she was at the bottom of the pyramid at that time. Yeah, she was a lone ranger on the Acorn rig that was like dealing in the art of bagging samples on an Acorn rig. So yeah, so her perspective on that discovery is what we kind of wanted to get, is that, yeah, like, how did she find it? And it's an interesting story because, yeah, like, I'm not saying, I'm not providing all the credit to her for it, but yeah, like, she kind of saw the full life cycle of the discovery from the early air core phase to then the drill out phase, and then she obviously went along with the project as it developed to kind of the resource stage and all of those stages with it. So it's an interesting perspective from her to go, even though she was not involved in the management side. Yeah, she was involved in a lot of the grunt work side,
yeah.
and arguably she contributed. You can debate it, right? She either contributed 100% of the work that involved getting that project through its life cycle, or she provided some number between 0 and 100. But it wasn't 0 and it wasn't 100, but it was some number in between, right? And then you can decide. Everyone can decide what that number is. Uh,
And it's really interesting because, like, Nick was the guy that came up with the concept to discover that thing, right? And, like, inarguably in my mind, I wouldn't have chosen that, right? Like, I look back and I'm like, "It would be wonderful if I was the person that discovered that." I am not, and I wouldn't have been, right? It's different. And I've heard, different reasons. I really wanna get him on the show too, because I'd love to hear what his recollections of the reasoning is behind it, because I remember talking about it at the time. But but it goes back to, like, when Aisha ran that program, and she mentions it in our interview, Malcolm Jolly and Julian Woodcock were very supportive of a hands-off management style. Let people stretch so that they can grow, right? And so they recognized that she was very, very young, and they allowed, because at the time when we did the drill out, or started the drill out. I was like, newly promoted to senior geo there. I'd been a project geo when I started, and so they trusted my judgment on letting her run this program, and she knocked it out of the park, which is really exceptionally rare in my experience. Like, very rarely does a geo, because I think she was a exploration geo or a graduate geo at the time. I can't remember which. I think she was an exploration geo. So she'd been a graduate geo. Goldfields, I think, moved people around, had them do different roles, and then she landed in this team. And so you think about going from logging Air Corps, and granted, she was well prepared by her education, right? Like she had a master's from UBC, and but she hadn't done her PhD yet. That was later, and but so she was, like well educated and very intelligent, but she jumped into managing this, which is not an easy task, right? When you go to managing the day to day of rig moves and, like you were talking about preparing sumps and pads and all these things, right? All the work that goes into doing that. But also we had the backing of a whole team, right? So at the time, like I think there was nominally 15 people in this project gen. We only got to that towards the very end of my time there because it takes time to hire, right? So they ramped up from
Yeah.
6 people to 10 people and then 12 people. And then I think we got to 14. And then I think it was only right before, like I left Australia that we got to 15. Um, and so you go from like, ramping up from 6 people up, like that's its own challenge, right? Like how do you integrate
Hmm.
those people in the team? Like for myself, I was literally in the flight over to Australia. I was supposed to go work in a different team, and they made the decision as I was in the air that I was actually going to go and work in Project Gen instead. And so like literally when I took off, I had one job, and when I landed, I had a different job. Right?
Hmm.
And it was, that has its own challenges, but that whole team supported all of the efforts of this program, right? So, like, there, like, my right-hand person was this guy, Blair, and Blair, he backed me up whenever I needed time to help Aisha with problems. He would take on and backstop me to take on duties and responsibilities,
Yeah.
and then we would get a project done, and like, so it was all these people would act as a backstop and support for, and it wasn't just Aisha because we had, I think we drilled over 100 drill program, or we did 100 target tests that year, of which I think it was probably 60 of them got drilled, something like that. It was an exceptionally large drill program. I think it was probably one of the largest drill programs in the history of that project. I remember, like, it was shocking how many rigs we had turning and how much work we did, right? But in this process, whenever someone needed help, someone else in the team would step up and do it, right? Like, like I remember even just tracking our progress on these. I think it was Paul Edmonds and Dale Sanderson built this amazing spreadsheet that interacted with our database with ODBC links, so it was all up to date. And so I could just go and look at something and have an exact idea of where everything was and what needed to be done. And so you think about like that, if my time hadn't been freed up by these people doing that, I
Hmm.
wouldn't have been free to help Aisha with whatever questions she had. And so you think about how many people behind the scenes, maybe they weren't even ever involved in Invincible, but they made Invincible happen, right? And so, I mean, we had a geochemist, Mary Jane, and like I would just, we all shared this giant open, office space. It was like with the cubicles. We called it the fishbowl, right? And so you could walk around the fishbowl and ask people questions, right? And be like, "Oh, Mary Jane, we're just getting some geochem results back. Let's work on doing this workup." Like, and she talks, like Aisha talks about the embedded research, and we could go and ask him questions, right? And so it's interesting because like Aisha was the person that handled that program, and she did it phenomenally well. I could not have been happier, but I look back and I'm like, I couldn't have done my job if it wasn't for the entire cast of people in that office. Like, there's not a
Mm.
single one of them that I went, "Oh, like they really didn't contribute to this." They all did. And so, it's interesting because of the vagaries of fate sometimes. I got involved in managing this program, well, managing the person managing this program. But my counterpart, Dale Sanderson, he was this enormous resource of information, and I think he was the one that started, like, this, the initial diamond, and then, we had a reshuffling of what tasks we wanted to do, and so we divided up the work on this project. And so I look at, like, having him as the co-senior leading this Project Gen team, we definitely wouldn't have achieved what we did if he wasn't involved, right? And so maybe he wasn't involved in this aspect of it, but he was certainly involved in the success of it, right? And how do you even capture things like that? You think about like a book on if they ever wrote a book on the discovery of Invincible, how the hell do you write it to give all of the people credit? Like our resource estimator, like just how much back and forth he and I had on what he needed to see to get confidence. And then, we would have meetings with Aisha and everybody else involved. And then meanwhile, Julian and Malcolm are moving all the chess pieces around to get this whole thing to happen. And I just look at that, I'm like, that's what I want to explore, right? Because I had my own experience and my time in the movie was very short, and a lot of it was learning, critical things like I'd never ever worked in regolith before, and then having to log regolith on like an Air Corps program was like, what is this? you know, and
Yeah.
so,
Just- yeah,
but at
what
the
is
same
this red
time,
dust? Like where people
yeah.
judge it by the like the the scale of redness to it, and you're like, this is bullshit. Like people are making this stuff up. This doesn't mean anything.
It was so wild, and then, like, I remember they had such and again, it goes back to the work that WMC had done and Goldfields encouraged to continue doing, right? That's a key thing,
Hmm.
is Goldfields coulda come in with their own management team and been like, and I can't do a great South African accent, but they coulda been like, "Fut your bikie?" Like, there's the saying, I
Yeah,
probably shouldn't say the whole thing, but it's like, "Take your coat and F off," right? And,
yeah.
and they coulda just completely gotten rid of that culture and replaced it with their
Hmm.
own. And instead, they saw the value in melding the cultures, right? And saying, oh, well, Goldfields does these things really well. WMC did those things really well. Let's encourage those things to continue growing, right? And so I love this concept of how much had to happen to enable this discovery, right? Where like, the simple fact is like, okay, NVK came up with the target. Gustav as the senior approved it. They started the initial diamond program. Ayesha managed the diamond program, turned into a discovery. Then it got handed over to I think it was Greg Tossel next, and then he did the drill out like to convert it from infer resource to the next level, and then the mining, like that's
Yeah, yeah.
the abbreviated trailer, right? But the part that matters is the crazy contribution that all these individuals make in it, right? And
Hmm.
I'm fascinated by how easily that could have been different if one person wasn't involved, right? You think about like if Dale wasn't involved, like the whole discovery could have been completely different story. We might not have had the success. I did a talk later, um, on, like, the drilling and, like, I took all, like, because it's all this public open source data you can get from Australia's,
Yeah,
DMP, and so I pulled in the drilling and you had, like, the hole IDs, and so I could infer, some chronological order from hole IDs, and I think they had, start dates too. But, anyways, I ran a simulation on, how many ways you could have drilled this that essentially didn't result in a discovery using existing drill holes, not using the idea of you could have possibly drilled into a dead spot, but actually using existing drilling and then using like random filters. I did this whole talk on it. It's an incredible amount of luck that the first 3 holes missed and the next 4 hit. It's an
hmm,
incredible amount of luck. And there's a number of scenarios where 0 holes hit or 1 hole hit. And I just look at all those things. It's like how fascinating to have all of these dominoes have to fall just right. And how many discoveries are out there that haven't had the dominoes fall right? And how do we engage teams to reset the dominoes and start the stack going again so that maybe some of these orphan discoveries can turn into something, right?
yeah. That's right. And I think, I mean, yeah, like we talked about like why large teams matter, and I think this is kind of like the aspect, right, where I mean, we should talk about this, right? So I'll ask you the question at the end of my kind of statement about what is the lesson you got out of the Invincible Discovery. We got Aisha to talk about the lesson she got out of it. But the one thing that I found really fascinating was that there were so many points along this kind of journey or this story where someone could have said no and it would have kiboshed the whole project, right? Like, like somewhere in upper management, someone could have just said, no, this is not what we're going to do because we don't understand this deposit style. We have not explored under the lake. We're not interested in exploring under the lake. Like all of these type of things could have easily happened. And all it would have taken is the wrong person in the right role, like towards the top of the pyramid, and they're going to kibosh this whole thing. So when you talk to Julian,
100%.
this would be an interesting thing to ask him to go like, did you ever feel like wanting to say no to all the stuff you were being told, right?
Yeah.
And so so in big teams, I think this is where it can be a positive and a negative. Where like if you're a big team, you might be far removed where someone could just go, I don't know what these crazy guys are doing. These dozen people that I've hired that are like going off for this project. But also they could again go actually, like you had the luxury to kind of sit there and think about how you could do it, um, and leverage all of the other expertise in house that was available. Um, like another comment I kind of got out of like the Aisha story is that like Aisha also happened to be at the right time on the right deposit. Like she kind of mentioned that like one yes, it was a deposit style that Goldfields was not familiar with at that time, but in the end, it was actually something that was relatively easy to kind of unravel early, and then it just became an aspect where you just had to drill the thing out with the geological certainty that you'd already kind of accumulated, right? So so I think that even plays a role in the fact that if this was an overly complicated ore body that would have taken years to kind of unravel, maybe someone would have said no then, right? Because the thing moved so quickly, they couldn't say no to some degree.
And it's interesting as well, the timing could not have been better because gold had gone on this record skyrocket, and
Yeah.
I think the initial inferred resource was in December of 2012, and, and if you look at the price of gold, I think, or no, it was maybe in November. It might have been November because I think we actually published it right before I left, and I left in November of 2000, or I left maybe it was first week of December, something like it was right around Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And that's actually why, like, there's many things that I reasons I left, like there was big strikes in South Africa at the time that impacted goldfields. There was a decision to, if I remember right, they decided to go owner operator, and so then bought all this equipment. And then gold crashed, right? Or started crashing. Like, we didn't realize it would go down as low as it did. But we had giant layoffs, and it was like essentially a voluntary layoff, a voluntary redundancy in the exploration team, and I think we went from 15 to 6. It
Wow.
might have been to 9, I can't remember. But yeah, so, like, that was, like, kinda one of my final acts as this manager after this, what I viewed as a ripping good discovery, was, "Great, we just did an inferred resource, and now I get to lay off a huge portion of my team that absolutely knocked every aspect of their jobs out of the park." And to me, that was awful, right? Like, you can't even begin to talk about how terrible that is, right? And so, yeah, so I then took the opportunity to get a voluntary redundancy, and came back to the US.
Yeah.
And I just
And so
think
and so
about that
that
some.
so that is a defining lesson you learned out of Invincible is how to get a voluntary redundancy out of a discovery, did you? That's
Yeah,
excellent.
like, succeed and fail at the same time?
Yeah, that's
Um,
how what is it? How do you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory? You get a voluntary redundancy. That's what you do.
and actually that's a great lead because, I and I don't know for sure because, like, obviously, like, I don't work there anymore, but I don't think they've had another big discovery since then. And how much
Mm.
of that is because you shattered an extremely effective team, right? And that's a challenge. I remember the conversations where people, we're putting in for voluntary redundancies with the of course the axe hanging over the entire time that if we don't get enough people volunteering, that the headsman's axe is coming for people, and you go back to like how do you because unfortunately throughout my career I've had several layoffs where I've had to lay off people, and I can't think of a time when I laid off someone that I didn't see as a contributor to my project. I've never been like, "Oh, yeah, we cut the dead wood," which is what you always hear, right? "Oh, yeah, layoffs, we cut the dead wood, and you move forward." That is bullshit in my experience. Like, I have yet to cut the dead wood from any of my teams, and it was always good people, for various reasons getting laid off, and,
I mean, that's an interesting aspect, right? Because yeah, like I always wonder about that, right? It's rare that you ever see a championship team get culled the year after they win a championship. Yeah, don't they keep them together? It's like yeah, like Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls or whoever. Like I'm dating myself by this reference, but yeah, like, Oklahoma Thunder won the NBA championship, right? It's like they win it, they go, great job, guys, you're all out. Like half of the team is going to get sacked. Yeah, like I don't hear that, right? What they go is like, actually, you know what? We need to tinker with it a little bit because we need to get rid of some people, and maybe we can make the team better by bringing in other people. But we don't hardly ever see, we hardly ever see championship teams get wholesale cut like 50%. Like I don't see
it
that in sports organizations, and
no, and
so clearly they understand that it's hard to get to the top of the mountain, and you don't really need to, like destroy that ability of getting there.
yeah, and I guess to me, that's one of the biggest lessons is the critical nature of your team compositions, right? Like, and it was the first truly diverse team I worked with, both in terms of like gender, race, national origin, but more, it was the first team I worked with that truly had diverse points of view. And of course that's gonna suffer when it gets, when the headsman's axe comes. But I look at, like, to me, it made me go, "I could build a team like this," right? I could intentionally build a team like this, and I've never had the opportunity because budget considerations and everything and, like, not being, like, a high enough level to matter, But it's made me just realize, if you could build a dream team, what would that be like, right? Because I saw how much we accomplished with this intentional hiring of different skill sets, or maybe it was luck. Who knows? Like I was involved in some of the hiring, right? And I feel we did continue to build on that diverse skill set and experience and things like that. Um, but I've puzzled a lot over how rarely we've given people the opportunity to intentionally build a team, right? And you think
Hmm.
about, someone like I talked about Grigori leaving Newmont, and then his subsequent replacements. And there were several over the years. In the last few years, we've had a lady named Erin Workman that's been doing that. And of course, I'm not involved in those discussions, so I don't know. But I imagine she doesn't have the ability to build a team from scratch that she wants, right? So you have to inherit the work of your predecessors and then over time change and meld it and morph it. But man, what would it be like if like imagine if Aaron was able to come into that role and be like, I'm building a new team for exploration based on all my experiences, and this is what it's gonna look like from scratch, and, what would we be able to achieve, right? Like, what could we do? Because I don't know if I've heard of anybody doing that, like, maybe if you started up your own junior or something like that, but then you never have funding, right?
Correct. Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's an interesting perspective. Like, do you get another roll of the dice? And I think this is maybe maybe this is what's changed. Like, what's changed is that the companies like WMC and like the old kind of, like Placer and all these guys, they were happy to keep the team together, knowing that it could still get shit done. Right? Maybe that's what's changed, right? Like maybe they realize that, like we have good people, let's not kick him to the curb.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really key thing, as I've long thought that the best way to run an exploration company, or any company for that matter, but for specifically exploration, because that's my focus, um, is to say we know the business is cyclical. We know gold's gonna go up, we know it's gonna go down. Like, yeah, we're at peak right now. We're about the 10-year point, so maybe it's, about due to start crashing, which everybody says this time is different every single time. But I go, okay, so let's plan for the downturns and let's budget for the downturns. Let's take that, like the heap of cash that you can make when gold's high, and let's say this is earmarked for exploration in the next downturn. We're going to retain our team size, but also when things are going crazy, we're not going to overhire. We're not going to hire according to the price of gold. We're going to say, what is the size of team that we can do this work at? And we're going to consistently fund them during the gold time, because you think about, if you can discover a mine in the downturn, by the time you've gotten it to a point where you could do a
That's
PEA
right.
and then, like a definitive, you could potentially put that thing into production when gold is ramping up, right? And so if
Yeah.
all your costing and everything is designed for $600 gold, and all of a sudden you're going up to 10, like 1,000, 1,200, $1,500, because I really don't believe, granted, I also said we would never get to $2,500 gold, and clearly I had to eat crow on that one. But I do believe that we're due for another crash, and it's just about the right timing for it to happen now, right?
Mhm.
So why can't we be intentional about our exploration efforts, planning for the cyclical nature of exploration? Because then you could say, I'm hiring people not for 2 years or 3 years. I'm hiring them for a career, and I want to keep them and train them and develop them and continue to do exploration irregardless of the gold price. We're going to do the same level of drilling in the downturns as we do in the upturns. So maybe you cut those peaks down and then you raise the bottoms up, you know? So,
That's right. You kind of like balance it out, right? Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect. That's an aspect that I've always felt that has changed, I think. I think it's changed in that companies aren't willing to keep the teams together. I think they think of them as transient, and they feel that a Scott Briscoe as a senior geologist can be replaced by someone else named Adam Briscoe, and like like there's no value in keeping Scott around. So, like we'll get rid of him. And then when we need another Scott, we'll just hire Scott again. And I think that's
let's
what's
let's be
changed.
realistic. It'd be a Steve so that they could keep the same usernames and
Yeah,
all that.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. But I think like to me, that's something I've always felt has changed is that I think
Yeah.
you see this long history of like kind of people being involved in companies and that slow learning curve that they go on. And now I feel like teams are considered, or people as a resource are considered very transient. Yeah, like they're a commodity that can be traded and it can be gotten rid of whenever they want. And I think, and you look at like, and even I think like small companies now, I think like when they find something, like the band doesn't quite get back together in the same way in a different
Yeah.
company, right? Like,
Yeah. There's something
there's
unique,
always a
right?
yeah, there's always a Yoko Ono and John Lennon that break apart and go their own
Yeah.
way, like out of the band, and you always lose a certain je ne sais quoi out of it.
I think that's, and I guess that's, maybe another lesson, is how fragile success can be, right? Where it's all of these super unique ingredients. And so maybe that actually refutes my idea earlier of the explore at a continuous budget level throughout price cycles. Is maybe that's the refutation of it, is maybe it's to say, when when the band gets together, drill, and then when the
Yeah,
band breaks up, slow it down. Maybe it's based on that, right? Like, maybe it's
yeah,
very
yeah,
much when you're having success, fun success, and then when you're having, like a slow path, maybe dial it back. I don't know, maybe that's a better way to
yeah.
do
I
it.
know.
Who knows?
Maybe the model for the band analogy isn't you two that stayed together for so long. It's more like Oasis, yeah, like who get together for a tour, and by the end of the tour, they want to kill each other. So they break apart, and then but when they get together, man, they get magic. Like they can do a tour, they can punch out a record that's incredible. But the
Yeah.
rest of the time, they want to kill each other, and they're not in the same room. Like maybe that's the
It's
analogy you got to use.
that actually might actually be way more accurate, and I don't know. It's so that's actually one of the things I really hope to explore in this podcast is maybe all of my ideas on what success come from are wrong. And maybe we'll find during doing this podcast that the ingredients are totally different than what we think. And I don't believe they're random. Maybe they are, but I don't believe they are. Kinda like, I always felt like when I would show up at a project and I'd be asking questions about the geology and people would be like, "Oh, yeah, no, that's too complicated, we can't model it." I always go, "That's where our opportunity is we're missing something. There's some piece of data that we're not collecting, or there's data that we're collecting wrong or whatever, but it's never too complicated. I mean, it's always too complicated to perfectly model, but it's never too complicated to make a model, and if it is, we're missing something, and so, I don't know. I'll be really interested to see just how all of this goes because, like, fundamentally, I love exploration, right? I love the experience of discovery, the excitement of discovery, the motivation people get, right? Like, like, where because you get tired, right? Like, you get exhausted when you're working the long hours when you found something, but just seeing, people show up in just absolute shit conditions and continue to give their best, like, I remember working in Battle Mountain in this core shed, it was like 45 minutes outside of Battle Mountain, and we had this paper wheel on the wall of where we would go to dinner, and, like, 95% of the wheel is taken up by local businesses, and then there's this little tiny sliver that it's like drive to Winnemucca on our dollar and pay for a nicer dinner at a different restaurant. And it was like, and that was like every day we like spin the wheel and be like, "Come on, oh, we're going to the Owl Club again," or whatever, right? And and I look at like that, and I'm like, I think it's because fundamentally, we were in the middle of a discovery. We knew we were in the middle of the discovery, and we dealt with absolutely terrible conditions. Like I remember, you know, um, it's freezing cold. We're drilling on a mountainside, and we have like this whole series of pumps to bring water up to the drill rigs because it was like you couldn't get a water truck up there, and and just like things freezing and our water, like because we had like guys that took care of the water lines for us, and they have like weed burners, and they're trying to keep things from freezing over at night, because it was well below 0 centigrade, and and people just did it. Like, people just showed up every day and did it, and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't glorious, and there's, like, all the terrible examples of people covered in mud and misery, but
Yeah,
the excitement's there, right? And you go back to, like, you can't quantify excitement, right? You can't prove even the existence of excitement, right? There's not a scientific instrument that can measure that, and yet it permeates a discovery,
yeah,
right?
that's why I'm.
Well, hopefully you enjoyed this first episode of the Discovery Files. If it was as fun for you to listen to as it was for us to record, we're going to have a great time. We're going to interview Aisha Ahmed next, and then we're going to hopefully work our way through one discovery at a time by talking to all the people on the teams. And hopefully we'll learn some new things along the way, and maybe someone listening to this will have a change of opinion and make a new discovery of their own, and then we'll have you on the show. So I really look forward to seeing where we go with this.
Digging deep where the stories hide, through the hills and the mountains wide. Pickaxe swing and the earth unfolds, chasing dreams in the dirt and gold. Geology calling under our feet, Secrets are buried in the rock and heat. With a heart full of wonder and a map in hand, exploring the treasures of this great land.